board. I will ask you both to give us an introduction and a little bit of background to your experiences. Thank you for joining us and offering to give us evidence in respect of this investigation that we're carrying out to the impacts of COVID, the work of businesses, charities in response to COVID, and how that can help and inform making British society more integrated. So Stephen, if I could start with you, please. If you can give us an introduction to yourself and your background, that would be great.
Absolutely, and obviously delighted to provide evidence to the APPG. So my background is a serial entrepreneur who's worked out in the States, in the UK, and I passionately believe in an ethos which I describe as compassionate capitalism, which is essentially multi-stakeholder management. So boards and chief executives should not only be focused on profitability, which is one aspect, but it also on purpose, and really purposeful businesses serving obviously customers, employees, but also very much the environment, sustainability, and in the context of this discussion, the community that they serve and they are a key part of. So I've had over 30 years experience where I guess I've put this model and proven it to be very successful for businesses. I was a chief executive in the US, in California, of a NASDAQ business that was an early unicorn and very successful. Then I came back to the UK and I was chief executive of the most successful company on the London Stock Exchange for the period under my tenure, and implemented similar philosophies in terms of reaching out to the community and engaging more broadly as a business to do good and make a difference. And then actually I had a bit of time in government where I was chief operating officer of the UK government, and the motivation for me for doing that was public service. And then I went back at the 2015 to Sage, which is the largest UK tech company with over 2,000 people employed in the Northeast. And I took this model of, I guess, compassionate capitalism to Sage and introduced a program called the Sage Foundation, which has become the beating heart of the company 5 years on. And very simply, the philosophy and the structure of the program was this phrase we call 2 + 2 + 2, where 2% of employees' times, colleagues, was paid volunteering. So that's 5 days a year. 2% of notionally free cash flow generated by the company was granted to charitable donations. And also 2 free products from the company was provided to not-for-profits or charity to help them run their administration and their back office more efficiently, so they could deploy the resources that they had for the causes that they cared about. And I tend to find, in my experience, and maybe we'll get onto this, it's an incredible multiplier effect where you can create an ecosystem involving customers, partners, employees, and you can create a massive positive impact on the communities you serve. And since leaving Sage, I've, relevant to this conversation, I've been doing a lot of mentoring, particularly women entrepreneurs, and some philanthropic work, plus also working with a group called Together, which is sort of led by Dame Helen Morrissey, Justin Welby, Brendan Cox. And that really seeks to put, again, the whole essence of what Together stands for is bringing people together, unification, alignment, community, kindness. So ultimately, we are part of the business aspect of that really looks to connect businesses to their communities. And I think coming into COVID-19 and a lot of the divisions between old and young, rich and poor, different communities really does speak to some of the best things we've seen in business, and also really kind of gives me a lot of confidence that business plays a really vital role to rebuild better, but also the wealth creators, which is the business community, can really harness the power of their growth and wealth creation to really support the vulnerable and support communities. So I think, the reality, you know, as well as I do, we're going to go into a world next year of 2 to 3 million unemployed. We are going to go in a situation when I will go back to the 1980s, and when we had 3 million unemployed, and I used to do trips down to South Wales, and I went to Newcastle and Manchester, and I saw the deprivation, I saw the long lines outside the unemployment offices, and I saw and spoke to people who had, facing 3 generations of unemployment at that time, grandparents, parents, and children, and that's kind of been the reality. And I just thought at that time, there's got to be a role where the wealth creators, which is the business community, can be much more collaborative, can put communities at the heart and really play an active role, and almost take the essence of what we saw brilliantly actually during the Victorian times with the Rowntrees and the Terrys and the Cadburys and those businesses, where they really built vibrant communities and stepped in to support education systems, and made charity very personal to communities. So as well as that, I'm the director of Tech Nation, which is the platform for all the technology scale-ups across the UK, who are the engine room of job creation in the technology industry, which employs about 10% of the UK population. And actually technology was growing 6 times faster pre-pandemic than the rest of the economy. So it's a real engine room of growth. And also it tends to be very, very regionally deployed in Scotland, in Wales, in Northern Ireland. So great cities like Belfast, 26% of the employees work in technology. And in most big cities, it's about a fifth of the employment. So again, it's a kind of key aspect of how we rebuild Britain better. And some of the companies that have come through our programs are people like Deliveroo, Monzo, Revolut, Benevolent AI. And I think, ultimately, in terms of giving evidence to you today, I'd like to make sure that business is positioned as a key part of the answer and a part of the solution. And I think there's been many, many examples I'm happy to share with you during the pandemic where key business leaders and chief executives have done the right thing, taken salary sacrifice, given their salary to NHS charities, and really set the tone at the top of their companies that we're all in this together and that we can have a vibrant, prosperous future and create greater prosperity for all.
Thank you, Stephen. Ailbhe, can I come to you for an introduction and a little bit of background and some key themes from your experiences that you can contribute this morning? Thank you.
Absolutely. And also I'd like to say thank you very much for having us. So I'll say a little bit about Power to Change, the organisation I work for, as your members may not all be familiar with it, and a little bit about community business, which is what we support. Power to Change was established basically to give momentum to the community business sector, which predates our existence, but has grown rapidly in roughly the last decade. We're focused on England because we're funded by the National Lottery Community Fund. We were set up in 2015 with 150 million spend down endowment. So to date, we funded about just over 1,000 community businesses in England. And to give you a picture of what those are and look like, they're 69% are in the top 3 tiers of the indices of multiple deprivation. So we're talking about nearly 70% of these businesses are in the most deprived neighbourhoods in the country. Almost half of what we funded to date is in the north of England. And we estimate there's about 9,000 community businesses across England. And that's up from about 5,000 in 2015 when we were established. So I can't say it's causal, but certainly the existence of a funder that supports and helps grow the sector seems to be making a difference, as well as I think other factors which are driving the growth of community businesses around people coming together to do things with assets that matter to them in their communities and services that they see falling away that they'd like to see replaced. So a community business is established and run by a local community. It trades and invests all it returns back into the local area. So if you sort of think about a Venn diagram, a lot in common with charity and a lot in common with social enterprise. But compared to charity, you're talking about something that has to be a business. It's trading and it's got to have a viable business model. And compared to social enterprise, it's very locally run. So you're talking about the local community having that accountability. So this small community-based social enterprise effectively is very much serving the needs of a place. So very place-based and very concerned with making that place better and delivering what the local community needs. They do have a positive impact on places. So the things that they're involved in are around supporting local economic development, maintaining local services where cuts would have been seen and services have fallen away, but also developing social infrastructure, which I know that you have picked up on in your previous report and talked about that, those spaces for the community to meet, those places where people can come together and form those bonds and networks, providing a lot of that space. Improving the physical fabric of places and giving people a sense of control. A community can come together, take over a heritage building in a town centre or something, run services out of that, open it up for the community, establish a cafe. And the people who are involved in that, it's a real, as well as the benefit of what you're providing, there's a real sense of agency and a real sort of sense of empowerment that we're able to do something to improve our place. Majority of the community businesses that we have supported, and just more generally, even those the ones that we haven't, do seem to manage or own a building or a community space. They employ about 34,000 staff, but there's a huge volunteer workforce. So 6:1 is the ratio. There's over 200,000 volunteers involved in community businesses, and it varies a lot depending on the type of business, because these can be, there's a lot of the more familiar community centres, community hubs, who will have a lot of volunteers, but there are community energy companies, there are community run bus services in rural areas, communities taking over pubs in villages where that pub is closed and there isn't that social space. Similarly with shops in more rural locations, there's almost any economic sector there is, it seems there is an example.
Ailbhe, may I just ask a question of clarification, really?
Yes.
Can you just tell me what their legal structure is? Do they have a board? Do they have a board of trustees? Are they a charity? Are they a community interest company? What's the legal structure of them, please?
Yes, that comes up quite often. There isn't one single legal structure, and it's one of the challenges and why we spend quite a bit on research to understand the scope of the sector. So what we funded, the majority tend to be a company limited by guarantee with charitable status, is quite common, but there's a lot of community benefit societies, community interest companies. So the businesses choose the legal status, sometimes by default or by accident of what they're familiar with. Sometimes they're advised to take a particular structure. So community benefit society, if you're thinking of raising community shares, then there are certain structures you'd need to have to be able to do that. A lot of them choose the charitable status in order to get business rates relief if they've got a business in a high street in a town.
Thank you,
Ailbhe. It isn't that straightforward. There is quite a lot of variation.
Thank you. So we have got some pre-prepared questions, which Sally and I have divided up between us. If we can start to go through some of those, and we can open it up to sort of have a bit of a conversation, really. And please do feel free that if each of your respective organisations have got a perspective on the various questions that we're going to ask, please do indicate, and we can dive in. So if I can come back to you, Stephen, please. Can you explain to me what role you think that big business has in encouraging a more socially connected and integrated society? And has the impact of COVID-19 changed the way that businesses think about its role? You're on mute, Stephen.
Yeah, I'll just take myself off mute. Thanks. I think yes and yes. And I think what I'd like to do is also, if you're willing to do some shout outs of some fantastic leaders that we've seen during the crisis. And I think the role of big business is more pivotal than ever, and small businesses and community businesses. Because fundamentally, I heard a statistic that probably is really quite shocking. In the last 9 months, the government has actually increased the debt by as much as it did in the previous decade. So we now have a debt of over 2 trillion. Obviously, all the furloughs, the CBILS, and all the structures where amazingly quick Treasury response has come in to support business. And truthfully, if we're honest with ourselves, sort of red-blooded capitalism has been proven to have failed, because governments had to come in and take a very significant role. So the reality is, I think, Peter, in answer to your question, we have huge debt as a country. It's going to take decades to pay that debt off. But who are the wealth creators in the economy that can do that? Obviously, it's business. So I think when you look at seeing almost 10 million workers put on a program where 80% of their salary is paid by the government, it would have been unimaginable even this time last year. And therefore, because capitalism's failed in many respects, I think we need a new model. And we need a new model where COVID has really brought to the fore where communities have done amazing things around volunteering, around help for the vulnerable, around just kindness, really, expressed in everyday life. Then you sort of mold that in with the permanent crisis we face around net zero and climate change, because ultimately COVID, amazingly in 5 years' time, we'll view it as a temporary crisis that kind of changed our lives for that moment, whether it was in lockdown or whether we had to visit elderly relatives or whatever we did to make a difference during that crisis. But the permanent crisis we all face across the planet is climate change. And I do think there's a couple of cameos of really what touches people's hearts. So I just bought, and it's worth just doing a shout out for where leaders in business have made a massive difference and set the right tone. So for example, Tom Bloomfield at Monzo, who's actually one of the Tech Nation alumni, waived salary for a year. Nick Wilkinson, chief executive of Dunelm, again, waived his salary for this year. Neil Clifford at Kurt Geiger gave up 50% of his salary. Philip Janssen, the chief executive for British Telecom, gave up half his salary to NHS Charities. And then great entrepreneurs like Mark Cuban, actually, over in the US, has set up a program where all his employees can be reimbursed for lunches and coffee if they spend money at local independent businesses. So I just think there's just, it's 1,000 flowers blooming of where we've seen chief executives, boards and leaders really step up. And then obviously some of the public profile around companies like Burberry, Rolls-Royce, Airbus, who changed on a dime really from things like trench coat production in Yorkshire to actually building facilities and machinery for gowns manufacture, masks with Rolls-Royce, building ventilators. And then just some very local examples, a company down in Cornwall called Healy's Cider Farm, switched all their production facilities to build, create hand sanitizers for local hospitals and police. Vodafone, another great example where their program for the vulnerable customers, they switched their model from a pay monthly business to give them unlimited data free of charge. I could go on, but the final one, connected really to what Ailbhe said, is PG Tips, kind of got involved in a charity called Re-Engage, where they train volunteers to go and call on elderly people. So there's been so many examples of United Airlines, of Fuller's, where very much companies have stepped up and stepped into the crisis and done it in the right way. And sometimes their chief executives have really said, not only are we all in this together, but I'm going to give up the whole of my salary and I'm going to actually donate that to NHS Charities. And then loads of businesses have really done incredible things like Glasses Direct, e-bikes and local shops to give NHS employees either free prescription glasses or electronic bikes or groceries, deliveries. So I just think what we need to capture is that great sense of overwhelming compassion, love, support and kindness to reconnect our society and make sure that the society is integrated, holistic, and cares for the most vulnerable. And the institutions that can do that are the businesses, because they actually generate growth, pay their taxes, profitability, create jobs, create apprenticeships, and they can be a real catalyst to really fuel and reconnect. So I think the role of big business, directly to your question, has a really pivotal role to play in terms of authentically stepping forward, engaging with their communities, unleashing the power of their employees to really do volunteering and work in the communities, work with charities, and create a very different, holistic, integrated kind of model for Britain, where I think there's a great chance, and we've seen it in the crisis, where there's been an outpouring of genuine compassion and love and kindness, and a lot of that has come from businesses that should be respected, and that's why, again, the shout out, because we really want that behavior to continue. And I think what we'd love to see them now is sort of formalize their learnings of the COVID crisis and what they've done really well for the communities into programs that can be sustainable and support either volunteers or community projects or charities and the third sector to really make a difference across our society.
Thanks, Stephen. And very similar question to you, Ailbhe. What role does community businesses have in making us more socially connected, and what are the lessons learned from the impact of COVID?
Sure. I mean, I suppose what we're talking about and focusing on is the other end of the spectrum from the large businesses that Stephen has talked about. You know, that's that sort of bottom-up neighbourhood business. And when I submitted evidence to the inquiry, I mean, I sort of stated in a way it hasn't changed their perspective because they were always values driven. So these are businesses that come out of a place in order to meet social need and do that by turning a profit. But there has been a lot of, I mean, there's been a huge impact in terms of the pandemic on the sector, and we've done a lot of sort of data gathering and surveying to understand the impact of what's happened. And I think something's come up there about sustaining, which is really important. So one of the things we're really interested in and thinking about is the kind of community spirit that's happened and all the volunteering and all the businesses that we support and the great work that's going on. How can you sustain that for the longer term? Because there's going to be an exhaustion and there's going to be a financial impact where some of these, you know, really struggle to continue. And I noticed in your first report that analysis of mutual aid groups, looking at how they're thinner on the ground in the places with lower social capital and with less social fabric, you know, which doesn't have that infrastructure. And what we've been really interested in is trying to understand mutual aid works really well at that street level. But when you get to a sort of when you try to bring it up to a bigger level, you need the infrastructure, you need the community organizations or the community businesses and the organizations that have been there in a place and know the people and have the connections. So one of the things that we've taken from this crisis is that, and we've been sort of, you know, pushing for funding to support that, is a need for investment, especially in the more deprived places where the mutual aid groups weren't seen and where the social capital is lower. Because for the recovery and for levelling up, I mean, you need the social infrastructure to go with the hard infrastructure. You've got to sort of put those two together in the kinds of places that have, you know, struggled for decades and where infrastructure investment has gone in before and it hasn't really made that difference. So I think that's one of the learnings that we have taken from this, is that need to really, for us to really make the case for developing social infrastructure, community assets, community spaces, and these kind of community organizations in neighborhoods that really need them, where they're providing local jobs, they're starting to train and upskill the community, and they're connecting in. I think something that's really important is how you connect that very small stuff into the big businesses, into the local authorities, into some of those big local employers, and try and build those relationships in a place.
Can I just ask you both? We've seen this, businesses stepping up to the plate, getting integrated in their communities, giving back money, volunteering time, supporting the communities. And this is probably more a question for you, Stephen. Once this is all over, will big businesses just revert to type and become red-blooded capitalists again? And what do we do to actually harness the good work that's gone on? Because if these changes are actually making our societies more integrated and having an impact in the communities that you're serving and working in, how do we make sure that, and again, this is perhaps more for you, Stephen, how do we make sure that this isn't a passing fad and that this becomes a modus operandi for all businesses and replicates the great example of the organisations that Ailbhe's representing?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Peter. And it would be, you know, I guess, in the words of a great Prime Minister, never waste a crisis. It would be a travesty if that was the case, when we've seen such an outpouring of goodness. And what I would encourage, and many businesses do this, you know, great businesses like Salesforce, led by Mark Benioff, where they've embedded sort of compassionate capitalism and the community at the heart of the business in their values. And they've built these programs and these platforms where they encourage, obviously, people to give their time, and they pay them and celebrate them, and they also encourage connections into the community. And I think the visual, Peter, you know, when I was in California, actually, it struck me. You come out of your amazing glass office and you walk down the sidewalk and there's people who are homeless begging, you know, and California was, I think, if it was a country, it would be the 6th wealthiest country in the world. And there's obviously huge wealth with Apple now being worth more than the whole of the FTSE 100 companies combined. And the top 10 companies in the world, typically technology companies, are worth 10 trillion $10 trillion, which I think the UK GDP is just over 2 trillion. I know it's not comparing apples and apples, but the top 10 companies in the world are worth more than 4 times the UK economy. So what we've got to do is harness that amazing wealth and growth and job creation opportunity to connect it into the world that we've seen really very clearly in the crisis. And I think it's been a great rallying cry to bring out the best in people. So what I'd encourage, I'll just give you a cameo of what we set up as a SAGE Foundation. It was a very easy program to set up. But what it's done since was for volunteering, for charitable donations, and the other element of giving expertise and technology to the not-for-profit sector. And 4 years later, there's the team have done an amazing job. They've given 600 grants to charities. They've given over 100,000 days of volunteering. They've actually helped about 2,000 not-for-profits and charities benefiting from grants, and about 15 million pounds of volunteering time. So, and that's a program that is embraced by everybody in the company. And I think, it is a catalyst. What I'd love to see is that we take the crisis and use it as a catalyst where these individual actions of fantastic CEOs and leaders actually build a program of support for their communities. And I think Ailbhe's point's really important. The magic happens when you get a big company in a region working with the small companies and the charities and the local authorities to really support the vulnerable individuals and encourage local, smaller entrepreneurs. And they could be mutuals, they could be, social enterprises. But there can be rich local regional ecosystems that actually create opportunity and hope for the younger people coming out of the schools, sometimes, honestly, ill-equipped through the education system to go and get a job. And it could be in technology, or it could be in one of the growth industries. So there's a vast need, I think, at a very local level to really engage and connect and get the companies out of their glass offices, to get them into the communities, to work with local charities, to work on great projects like Ailbhe and that. A lot of fantastic people doing amazing work out there, but to make those connections, build the social integration, build the platforms, to give people sort of the opportunity to come and become employed and get a job, and give them hope rather than the opposite. And actually, again, when I was up in Newcastle, so how do you do this? We set the program up, I'll be honest, with a lot of people probably, and this may be a UK comment, and I apologize if it is, but there's probably a higher degree of cynicism in the UK. And there's a sort of perception that, is this authentic, which I think is fair, because it has to be authentic and it has to be embedded in the sort of tone at the top from the chief executive. So a great way to do that and overcome that sort of cynicism and sort of break through the heads, hearts, and then mobilize the hands on this sort of program is to actually lead it as a chief executive. So in a couple of things, I definitely received some resistance when we set up the foundation. And a lot of people thought, either it was tokenism or it was just for PR purposes. And actually then the words just speak louder and the actions have to take over. And when I went to actually Soweto, a town called Kliptown down in South Africa, where we got a massive operation, and the team, the 60 volunteers, had basically rebuilt a school in a really poor township with no running water, with corrugated iron, really poor accommodation. And for these kids, we'd put laptops and Wi-Fi and stuff to give them an opportunity, because, again, Nelson Mandela said the best way to give people an opportunity for finding a way out of poverty is to give them an education. So when you do these things, and we got loads of people there, and we did get press along, a lot of people came back to me that day who worked for me and said, that was actually the best day I've ever had in this company, because it really brought us connected to the people that we, drive by on the freeway and just go into our kind of security compounds and live, but we're not connected to the community. So I think there's a real, both the programmatic side you need to set up, which is pretty light touch and low investment, and we might come onto it, and it pays for itself thousands of times in terms of branding, recruitment, retention, and making you an attractive employer, but most of an authentic employer. But also, I think the other thing is it's really good to start telling the human stories and see chief executives. Other things we did was when there was flooding in the Northeast, we sent busloads of employees up to the Northeast to rescue elderly people's furniture from the flooded areas and sofas and beds and all that sort of stuff. I'd go off, and this is quite interesting. I'd go off and actually lead from the front and do volunteering days myself around the world, either for youth or for women, or in the case for education down in South Africa, or up in the Northeast, clearing parks and stuff like that. Whereas if they see it at the top, it's taken seriously, and you invest your time in the community projects, then actually it really is a big statement for that company to follow. And I think everybody wants to do the right thing and everybody wants to make a difference, but it's giving them the license and the agency to say that's the right thing to do, and we totally encourage it. And I think then it becomes very authentic, it becomes lived, and it becomes the reality of who you are as a business. And ultimately, it does add to the impact on your positive brand. And the other things we did, actually, which I'd encourage at a local level, is reach out, and we got lots of partners, employees. Just as a data point, there's been about 600 volunteering days from families of employees at Sage. So we got the families involved, we got partners involved, we got customers involved, and some of them were very personal. Goals around if someone had a passion around, cancer support and working in a hospice, or education and coding clubs for women, young girls, then they had the license to do that. But also we did these quite high profile volunteering days where everybody, including the chief executive, participated. And it was very successful. And then obviously the other probably criticism in the early days we got is if we took everybody, 14,000 employees and basically stopped work for a day and went into the community, then obviously, we had thousands of people in call centers, us doing customer calls and all these sort of things. So you have to be pragmatic and plan it carefully to make sure there's no disruption on the business. And we found a way to do that very successfully. And again, sort of overcome the cynics and win them around. And then you do create a volunteer army of supporters who want to do the right thing and find that it's a great way to express themselves through their work and actually integrate their work life with their sort of weekend life. Because final thing I'll say is we found when we surveyed what the employees actually did, there was a huge number of employees who did volunteering or went to be scout leaders or help in local schools. But previous to this, they'd have a complete wall between their personal life and their work life. And they wouldn't come to work and talk about what they'd done at the weekend if they'd gone and helped, homeless people on the streets of Newcastle. Whereas again, this gave them an agency and the power to talk in the office and bring charities in and have open evenings where we got some really incredible people from the charity sector in, and people who had been impacted through things like Duke of Edinburgh and Prince's Trust, and actually told the human stories again to connect the hearts and why these people seemingly with little opportunity were given a hand and really flourished and kind of became very successful in their own right. So it was, I think what I'm saying in summary is you need a program, you need to support it at the top, you need to walk the talk, and then you need to really just reinforce it with lots of human stories about the impact you're making. And it's not, it's not kind of happy clappy, it's real, it's hard, it's gritty, and it really makes a difference. And you need to, share that at the very top of the organization, the executive team with the board, and you need to put purpose at the heart of your company. And if you do that, I've got amazing personal experience and evidence to say that you'll be a more successful company than your competitors. During my tenure, the companies I led actually probably increased their market value by about $10 billion. So the shareholders are delighted. In one of the companies, Micro Focus, it was probably the best performing stock on the London Exchange for the 3 or 4 years I was there. So actually, by doing the right thing in the business, obviously loving customers, looking after them, looking after employees, but connecting to the community and the projects where you really need to, put the elbow to the wheel, you can actually be a more profitable and more successful company. So I think it's not either or, it's actually you have to embed this deep in the heart and the DNA of the company values and the culture.
Stephen, thank you. You've just answered my next question, which was about does this culture change effectively add to the bottom line? What is the business case? Does it improve brand loyalty, recruitment, retention, etc.? Can I just dive in a little bit further in terms of something that you said there in terms of cynicism, and you think that that's a British problem, and I'd welcome Ailbhe's comments in respect of this. Is cynicism a British problem? Does that lead to a lack of engagement previously? And that cynicism, how do we overcome that? And for many organisations, I think the perception is that corporate social responsibility has in the past perhaps been seen as a box ticking exercise. And I think what you're saying, Stephen, and I think what you do in respect to the organisations you represent, Ailbhe, is that corporate social responsibility, for want of a better phrase, it is actually not a box ticking exercise. It's fundamental to what you do and what you exist for. And how do we improve social integration by making sure that those businesses that are not community interest businesses, and those businesses that are not big businesses that have got the leadership skills and the vision that the people, the innovators, the entrepreneurs that you've talked about, Stephen, how do we make sure that those other businesses, the bulk of the businesses in between, take on board this story, this vision, to help their local communities and help them become more socially integrated? That's a very long-winded answer. How do we overcome cynicism? Let's shorten it. Ailbhe, to you, please.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the organisations we support directly, we see very little cynicism because, I mean, they live on hope and optimism, and it's amazing what they manage to achieve. But I think there's an important point. So I remember talking to the chief executive of NAVCA during the pandemic, and one of the things she said that's really stuck in my head was, we actually don't need more volunteers right now. So CSR has had a bad rep, of course, in the past. And I think what really matters is building up those relationships. And so that you've got the larger businesses in a place really connected to the smaller community organizations and the networks. And so when help is needed, they can step forward, but they can not overwhelm with a sudden rush of volunteers and there's no way to use them and we're not sure what to do with them. You've built up those relationships, and actually they can call you up and they can talk to you about what's needed. And it's a much more equal relationship where, I think that where CSR has got a bad rep, it's because it seemed like coming in, we'll give you a volunteering day, there's 100 people who you didn't necessarily need, and then they leave again. And it's not a sustained relationship. So a sort of a different example, we've been doing a lot of work this year around the high street, which has obviously it was already struggling, but COVID has, massively changed that situation. But also town centres or high streets are hugely important for social integration because they're where people mix. It's where you have the opportunity to mix with people who you might not mix in your usual sort of work or personal life. And we've been doing some work on community businesses getting into high street properties and reopening buildings and running cafes, and we've seen evidence that they diversify high streets, they bring other people in, which is all good. But one of the really encouraging things we've seen is talking to developers and private sector owners on the high street and actually uncovering quite a lot of really good practice. Big asset managers and big developers developing flexible sort of social leases where they recognize the value of those community organizations in the mix in their portfolio and in the high street, and they realize that this is part of what you need to bring the high street back to life in the town centre. And they're doing a lot of work to sort of, it is driven by social impact, but they also talk about, Mark Robinson, who runs Ailbhe, was talking about it is actually economic. They've done the research on it, and it has also got an economic impact. The turnover of your portfolio and sort of the benefit to the rest of your portfolio by putting that interesting mix in as part of it is seen in the bottom line, as well as in the fact that, as a company, you feel like you're doing the right thing for the places you're invested in.
Stephen?
Yeah, so if you're okay, Peter, I'll do it in two stages. One is on the economic benefits that we found, and also then how do you break the cynicism down? Certainly, we found, and we had these kind of key performance indicators, KPIs, but we measured a huge amount of things that matter to our customers, our partners, and our employees. So externally, brand awareness is one of the things we measured. And in some countries like the US and Germany, it actually leapt from like 1% of people to 10%. And one of the key factors was the Sage Foundation being out there, active in the communities. The other things were important to us were things like net promoter scores, and they actually went from kind of a very mixed picture, but generally flat or negative, to very positive. And it's a key measure of whether you have detractors or advocates as customers. And during the tenure, again, because partly we got customers involved, a lot of these small businesses across Britain, around the world, who are Sage customers, involved in the Foundation program. And again, you know, if you're out there, as I was, either clearing parks for scout camps or working with schools down in South Africa, in the townships, and you're with your customers and partners, they see a very different side of an individual and a much more human side. And you know, you could do advertising during the FA Cup final, and it wouldn't have the same impact as being down there, rolling your sleeves up, and just being a normal human being, making a difference in a community. So, so we measured net promoter scores, and that actually trended all up. And part of that was around the foundation. And then the cost of recruitment reduced, referrals from employees increased, and retention improved. So I actually tend to love all those kind of data points because they're important to, I guess, keep you honest. But the other thing I used to do is a lot of like town hall meetings and fireside chats with employees, and just ask them the question about, you know, what impact the Sage Foundation had. And just anecdotally, 40% of the Gen Zs and millennials said one of the key reasons they joined Sage was because of the Sage Foundation. And likewise, when I went out with customers and say, you know, why do you like Sage? What do you think of it? Tell me how it is. And one of the factors they always raised was the Sage Foundation. So there was both anecdotal and economic data, and, you know, key performance indicators that said that I think we made a big difference. The other thing which could fundamentally, so how do you break the cynicism down? There's probably three parts to this. One is, and this isn't in any way an ageist comment, we probably, though, found that the more enthusiasm, obviously, probably with the younger generations, Gen Z, millennials. And some of the older generations would say, actually, we've seen all this before, new chief executive, here we go again. And it's just that institutionalization of people in the same company where there's a resistance to change. And the way to change that was just to show them and engage with them and actually see right from the top of the organization that this was something that everybody cared about. And with how do we win them around? We won the hearts and minds really through what you call, I guess, nudging. You sort of show me what the impact was. And I think, Peter, you hit the nail on the head. In a lot of British companies, this has been a box ticking exercise. You know, come around to the annual report. What do we write about corporate social responsibility? Let's tick all the boxes. But that's such a sterile way of looking at it, and it's not embedded in the heart of the business. So the best way to show, and particularly any cynics in your company and outside, some of the press and media, would be to actually keep it going, build momentum, and do it yourself and lead from the front. The other thing I'd say is I'm not advocating all volunteering is good, because I got told by a lot of fantastic people in the community that it's great, Stephen, to see you come and paint, you know, schools and stuff. But honestly, I'm a hopeless painter. And there's much more competent people than me and my colleagues who could do it. But actually what they'd love us to do is go into schools for young girls and do coding classes, or mentor their business leaders in the charity, where my business skills can be a lot more useful than, you know, painting initiatives. And actually that spawned a lot more kind of focused volunteering around where can we use our best skills to maximize the value of the impact. And actually it also spawned other things around. There was a project again actually in South Africa where there's a massive issue around domestic violence of particularly women, And we used our artificial intelligence technology to build a program called Rainbow that actually provided a very safe environment for women to get really good advice around how to handle domestic violence. So I think around some of these initiatives, the nice thing is that when you sort of take the first step, you don't know what the destination may be, and it actually can take you into some really exciting areas where you can just address some of these deeply embedded disadvantages or fundamentally barriers for the vulnerable in terms of opportunity. So I think generally, what you have to do is you have to, back to Ailbhe's what she said, you have to take the best practice, embed that and create a program. Then you actually get lots of people saying, this is fantastic. And you sort of internally build a volunteer army. You get people engaged and very energized. And then you can go out and, but you need it led from the top. And ultimately, to keep it going and coming out of COVID, I'd hope and encourage all chief executives to really give their executive full license to build programs that can make a difference to the community and build these rich ecosystems that Ailbhe's talked to, where you have communities, small businesses, and all connected on a mission to support vulnerable people at the grassroots level.
Thanks, Stephen. Sally, Anne, could I bring you in to pick up some of your questions?
Hang on, just unmuting myself. Thank you, Peter. I found the whole conversation absolutely fascinating. I know a lot about social, community businesses, social enterprises, and they're brilliant. And they're a completely different model, obviously, to the private sector, because they don't have shareholders, and they're not having to, give their shareholders dividends. So one of the things I really picked up on with Stephen there was how companies can work in local communities, not just by going down to the South Africa and building schools, but actually loads of companies. My patch is Hastings and Rye, and the levels of deprivation are quite bad, but our children could do with businesses and leaders of businesses going into the schools and the further education college and having a volunteer group where they will show children what there is out there, what jobs they're capable of, what they introduce them and talk to young people and give them work experience. That's what we need. It's that sort of focus on the community and the young people that we really need. So my question to both of you, so I think probably Stephen first, will be, how might businesses be encouraged to take a more active role in promoting social connection and integration beyond this year? We've seen a huge amount of community volunteering with businesses, etc., throughout coronavirus. So what can we do? What incentives could encourage business? And do you think there's a role for government policy here?
Wow, that's a big question. Great question, Sally Ann. And actually, I grew up in a town called Folkestone. So, and everybody thinks these seaside towns that were built out in Victorian times are glamorous, but boy, oh boy, there's just so much deprivation, mental health issues, homelessness, a lot of issues. So I totally get it. So I think kind of we can all play a role. I think this is where it's definitely not, we can't be spectators of this. We've got to be participants. So for example, Sally Ann, what can you do to make a difference? When you go and see an amazing company doing incredible volunteering work or making a difference down in Hastings on a project around homelessness, domestic violence, any of these things, blast it out on social media. Make sure the press are there. Get the media to stop the narrative about negativity. And when we see great examples of businesses taking responsibility and stepping in the community authentically to make real change happen, let's celebrate it and let's tell the story and tell the human stories. And I think that helps actually, Peter, shift the cynicism and negativity towards a much more positive narrative. So I think number one is we all got to step in and take responsibility. Number two, one thing I'm involved in is a project around Together. And I'm overwhelmed with the amazing charities across the UK who are doing incredible work. But sometimes it's in silos and sometimes it's not really joined up as effectively. So again, I think at a local level, particularly, MPs, it's a great way to connect these different dots together and really impact people's lives for the better. And I think that's where the magic happens, because it happens at the grassroots level. And whether it's you're dealing with homelessness, or you're dealing with kids to retrain them, or give them work experience, or give them that opportunity or the nudge to lift their eyes up to, you know, a career rather than, you know, unemployment and potentially crime, then I think that's a real kind of a tonic. And on my own experiences, truthfully, Sally Ann, I had to leave Folkestone because the only jobs there were at the time, there were boats. So you either worked on the boats with Townsend Torreson or P&O, or you went down the docks and worked in customs, or you worked in local government. And then kind of Saga, or the holiday company, came up as a key employer. And you'll find the same in places like Hastings. There's just not that hub of vibrant economy. But what you can do is encourage the bigger companies to work with the smaller companies, build the ecosystem, connect them to charities. And you probably can't be all things to all people. So you have to pick probably 2 or 3 initiatives, and it could be, depending on the local geography, the biggest problem might be giving kids opportunities or work experience. And there's programs that you can do and work with local charities and national charities to really address kind of the key things. So I would advocate at a local level, you sort of put most of the wood behind a few arrows. You don't try and do everything. But your gift as a member of parliament in a local area, you can galvanize communities to come together, and you have huge power to legitimate power to encourage people working for the common good. Now, government, I think, you know, obviously, and we've had a few misstarts on this. If you remember David Cameron's Big Society, and trying to put in, you know, by law, 5 days volunteering at the time, got at the time massive resistance and apathy, and sadly sort of died. Then if you, what can government do? So they could create some tax incentives around paid time that companies give up for their employees to help on community projects. They could do things that would be very simple to do. But again, has met lots of cynicisms. And, you know, every time I raise this, there'll be people said, well, we discussed that last decade, or we discussed that in 1960 and we didn't change it. But just changing the company law, section 172, to have companies and boards focused on profitability, they could introduce purpose to that and actually make it part of the law of Britain, where companies have to engage for their customers, their employees, and their community. So it's a much more plural, multi-stakeholder. Now, I've got, the good news is I've got loads of economic evidence where if companies do that, and I think most companies do, then they tend to be more successful and actually deliver, Sally Ann, better returns to their shareholders. So the most progressive companies around this area, I'll just use one example. Salesforce, which was created 20 years ago by Mark Benioff. You know, it's a company now with revenues of about 20 billion. And I think it's valued almost 200 billion. And day one, that company was set up with community and purpose at its very heart, with volunteering programs, with charitable donations, and they've made a massive difference to the communities where they operate. So government could do a few things around incentives, company law change. The other thing the government could do is staggering, but the government spends 280 billion across the wider public sector every year. So again, in the new world, the government can actually shift some of that procurement to actually have criteria where they give business for goods and services that either are provided to the NHS or central government, but they actually shift the dial to have criteria where they elevate purposeful companies. So that would be a really, actually a simple thing to implement, and that would have long-lasting effect. And then I think the other things they have done where they could shine a greater light, there's some amazing things happening in government. One thing called the Inclusive Economy Partnership, which is sort of sponsored with the Cabinet Office, where they do showcase, you know, the Paul Polmans and the incredible business leaders out there who are very much talking around compassion with capitalism and purpose with profit. And if they elevated that and again, just sort of emphasize the positive narrative. And then the final thing I think around this, that's why I'm so happy to give evidence, is the more we start talking about this and build it into the everyday narrative, the more we change behaviors and the more, you know, the cynicism abates and actually the more energy and passion and the more people will commit to this and know it's just part of going from tick boxes to really making it part of the DNA of every company. So I think the government can play a very active role, and I made some suggestions about what they could do, very practical changes to really galvanize our support around a much more integrated and socially coherent plan.
Thanks, Stephen. Ailbhe, would you like to?
Yes.
I asked the question again, Ailbhe.
Yeah, please do.
I thought, thank you so much, Stephen. That was really amazing. Ailbhe, so the question I have is, how might business be encouraged to take a more active role in promoting social connection and integration beyond this year, and what incentives might encourage business, more community businesses, and is there a role for government policy in encouraging community businesses?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, in Hastings, you've got some really great examples with Rock House and the Observer building, of course. So
I've been quite involved with that in terms of trying to get support. They are amazing. Jess Steele is just incredible, isn't she?
Yes, and I think Stephen pointed that out. Like one of the things that's very important to these organisations is local councillors and local MPs, like the local authority in particular. But that sort of local political support can make all the difference, and it's incredible. Just giving people permission, giving them a bit of space to try something out, and just helping them along the way is enormous. I think Stephen made another good point. You know, trying to force companies to do this is a very long battle of pushing a rock up a hill. But behaviour change and incentivising it is a whole other way of doing it. And also right now we've got such an opportunity. I mean, we've got such a moment of change. We don't know where it's all going to go, but I think there's a lot of opportunity around rethinking what town centres and places are about, making things more civic spaces. There is a lot of opportunity for like around workspace. You know, people are going to be working from home and working in different places and taking up other spaces. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for business to change that. And so like in terms of practically doing it, so around the high street stuff, we are involved in the High Streets Task Force, which is a government initiative. We've been on the board for that, and that is really just leading the way, trying to work, and that's, you know, British Property Federation as well, getting the developers together, getting the local authorities together, and trying to sort of showcase the best practice examples, talk about how the high street might be transformed. The impression I get is that most places get it and realise that we've got to move to something different. But it's how you get from here to there that people don't really know. So how do we transform our town centre and make it a civic space, which is, you know, full of people of all ages and diversity? And that's the real challenge, is giving people practical support. In terms of policy and what government can do to support this, I mean, things like the High Streets Task Force are fantastic, and the funding that's gone in there. Another opportunity, the Towns Fund is a really big opportunity. So, and I know that in Darlington, you have the Towns Fund deal.
So we have it in Hastings too.
Yes, yeah, that's right. And so we've been talking about things like the idea of a community improvement district, because at the moment it's quite difficult. So if a town centre is going to be a civic space, it's not just about retail. You want to bring everyone together to discuss how that might change and evolve. And we've been talking about the idea of a community improvement district, which could be piloted through the Towns Fund. So you bring retail together, businesses together with the local authority and the community. And in many places, this could even be community-led. We've seen lots of examples where community-led works. You're not going to have the capacity for that everywhere, but it seems a shame where there is the capacity, like in places like Hastings, to stamp it out, rather than giving the community the opportunity to actually come in and lead. A few other things. So, I mean, I've mentioned it a few times, but access to space is so important. You can't integrate if you can't come together. And there was a manifesto commitment last year to a community ownership fund, which still hasn't been realised, but I think it's just a hugely important idea that the government, you know, rightly took up, and I think should be put in place now when we kind of start to come out of this crisis, so that you can secure community space for people. That fund can be used in a lot of ways. I mean, it can be used to sort of drive social investment, as well as giving out grants to people to get hold of spaces and revive those for the community, but also trying to help crystallise that social capital. So in places maybe they had a mutual aid group, they'd like to build on that and come together and do something for the place for the longer term. And some of that funding could really help those places to get going. We've also called for, I mean, it's a longer game, but the Localism Act has been, and the Social Value Act have both been transformative in some ways, but in other ways not quite realised their potential. And so that local procurement, procurement with small businesses and businesses that really get mission is very important from government's point of view, and also local government. With the Localism Act, we've called for that to be strengthened because it doesn't give communities enough power. And Hastings, I'm sure, Jess Steele will be able to tell you all about this. It gives communities some power, but not enough. So it's still very difficult if you're a community and you want to get hold of a space. If the owner of that space isn't interested or willing to engage with you, it can still be very hard work.
Thank you. And I've got one last question for both of you. So I'll go to Stephen first. How can business groups best support with local charities, and can national or local government do more to support such partnerships?
Yeah, I think, again, Ailbhe's said some of this, and building on what she said, actually, we had amazing spaces, incredible offices, big atriums, and what we did was actually engage with the local community. So if local schools wanted to come and do Christmas plays, or music concerts, and also most companies, probably in Hastings, even small companies, would have nominated charities for a period of time. They might do it for 1 year. And a great way to do that is invite those charities to come in sort of an open day, open evening, or set them up with a stand in the lobby of the company at lunchtime, and people just go up and talk to them. So the more kind of we can connect those dots together. And I would always say, actually, so many times, no one from the community actually came to talk to us. So we went out to talk to the community. And when they realized that we weren't sort of locked away in some glass building and we're just human beings and just normal people, then actually sort of magic happens, because it becomes a two-way process. And it is very, very much that case. So in terms of business groups, I think, truthfully, there's no silver bullet here. You have to do a lot of things. But the essence of what we're talking about is you have a massive vision, thinking big, but you have to start small with baby steps. And then if you take those baby steps, they gather momentum. If they don't work, then you actually do some course correction and find out what does work, and connect your people in your company to the causes that they care about. But I think it's very easy for all businesses, particularly what we've seen through the pandemic, and many of them will have done this, is to connect to local charities. A lot of businesses have helped out with food banks, with deliveries to vulnerable people, elderly people. So that is a great platform to start saying, well, how can they sort of formalize it and programatize it, and not create loads of bureaucracy, but make it really part of the living, beating heart of the company. And things like open days, actually to invite the local MP, the councillor, the press, around some of the successes. And you want to make local heroes out of people who are really making the difference. And we want to have this culture where we celebrate these role models. And sometimes, I could argue that maybe sometimes in the UK, we have this sort of tall poppy syndrome, where people who do outstanding things, sadly, sometimes people take pot shots at them. But actually, there's just some amazing human beings out there doing incredible, fantastic leadership at the local level. And I would support them. If you can, actually, the other thing, Sally Hand, when you get an invite from number 10 that they want to have community leaders coming into number 10, people love that sort of recognition. Obviously, I'd love to see all these people at the local level celebrated through the honor system rather than business people, and actually, people who give their lives for the cause of the community and support the vulnerable. There's lots of things that we can do, but we need to step in there and lead that. And then obviously at a local level, particularly in deprived areas, I think there's the local authority, the LEPs. There's a lot of institutions where this agenda should be on their radar, and they should be in their LEPs at leadership team meetings. What are they doing to encourage the companies within their network to put this at the heart of the business, as well as the other priorities of growth and winning customers and exports and all those important things. And then in areas where they have a local mayor, that role can be very much a beacon of light to galvanize the community together. And then probably the final thing what government could do is actually work with the charities and sort of build up this best practice repository. So, build up a digital platform through some of the initiatives like the Inclusive Economy Partnership, where things that are really working and stories that we really want to celebrate are actually held and available, you know, could be across Gov UK. So people could just search on something and find out all the great local projects in their area, how to connect, who to talk to, how to engage, and just make it very easy that this not only becomes the way we are, but makes everybody, through like the click of a button on your phone, one step away from actually being with someone they can help or make a difference to. And then the other thing I think overarching around this, and this is why I welcome this committee, is, you know, I really would encourage the media, especially coming out of the pandemic, to switch gears and switch into a positive narrative, and just tell the human stories of the amazing things that are happening there right across the UK. And seeing so many more of those, not only on the regional TV, but also on national TV, where we actually have a culture that we want to celebrate these local heroes and say, actually, they're great role models for people to follow, and we want more of them. Because if you look at the press, even today, obviously it's all about the vaccine, but generally, you know, we put some of these fantastic people in a position where they either don't get the profile, or, you know, the news is dominated by a world of negativity and a sea of depression. Whereas, you know, there's some real bright sparks and spots that happens, rays of sunshine through the pandemic, that we really now need to come out of and emerge from the COVID crisis. Going to have a lot of unemployment, a lot of deprivation, and it's a greater time ever for the press and the media to take great responsibility. And then obviously, you know, you guys do quite a bit on social media as well, just to build that ecosystem where there's a lot of engagement, positivity, and showcasing the excellent work that's going on at the grassroots level to give people real hope and encouragement.
Thank you, Stephen.
I have to agree with that, actually. I mean, I have to say, I think that our poor school children have been victimised at the moment by the press by saying they're all going to fail because they haven't been at school. I just think it's actually quite shocking, but we can't victimise them. Ailbhe, I've got the last question I've got for you is, can national or local government, I think actually you've covered it, because you're talking about the Localism Act and things like that, and I think, but just to make sure that there isn't anything more, can local or national government do more to support partnerships and community businesses? I think you've probably covered it when you were talking before.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, local government is critical, really, and a huge supporter. So things like community asset transfer, which happens at a very, you know, patchily across the country. In some places really fantastic, in other places barely at all. So giving that surplus space to communities to do something useful with, rather than, you know, paying security charges to keep it locked up. I talked about community improvement districts and the idea of getting so in places like Hastings, getting those people into the conversations about local economic development, getting them in to talk to the left, bringing them to the table in those kinds of discussions, I think is really important. And central government, I mentioned, I mean, I know nobody likes an ask for funding and it's difficult, but I think there are other ways as well that central government, I mean, there's a certain amount of setting the tone, you know, talking about, I mean, there's been a lot of talk about community spirit, really talking about how important this resilience is in this sort of insensitive place, and giving people that sort of autonomy and power to do things for themselves and make their own places better is really important. And even talking that up would make a huge difference, really giving that higher profile than it has at the moment in government. I think there is a need for funding to support these organizations. I mean, obviously we support the organizations, but I think there are other ways, and procurement is a very, very big lever. So encouraging businesses to buy local and have local supply chains and support those smaller organizations, as well as government leading the way by doing it itself. And the NHS, we've had some really good conversations with the NHS this year, and that idea that they're beginning to realise what a local anchor the NHS is in each place that it's based, because obviously it's everywhere, and the transformative role they can play as well in places just through their procurement and supply chains and those relationships.
Thank you, everybody. We've come to the end of our prepared questions, and we've covered an awful lot of ground. I mean, some of the things that you contributed this morning, the two of you, has been absolute gold dust. I particularly love my big takeaway from today. Is something you said, Stephen, and I think it goes to the heart of everything that businesses stand for, and we, myself and Sally Ann as local politicians. You know, when you said that the magic happens at the grassroots, and I think that's absolutely true. I just want to make a comment with regards to the things that you said about the big society, and what David Cameron said at the time, I think really resonated with me, because he was talking about those individuals, those charities, those groups in our communities that were already doing some amazing things. And we've talked about them already in terms of recognition, that they were our unsung heroes. And I think for many of us in our communities, those things are still happening. And we've actually seen over the last 9 months through the pandemic, our communities and our businesses and our charities in our communities really step up to the plate. And what we're hoping to do through the work of this APPG is to come together with a set of ideas and discussions and policies that can really help harness that, to make sure that our communities are more integrated, that those volunteers do continue to step up to the plate and get involved, and a more integrated society. We talked at the very start about the less engaged communities are, where there is lack of civic engagement and more deprivation, there is a lack of community engagement and a lack of integration. It's how we really harness those real positives and make tangible changes to policy that harnesses the good stuff. I just want to ask you one final question each, really. And I think I probably know the answer to it, and it's something that came out of our last evidence session. And it's a thread that seems to have run through a number of things. We've talked about business improvement districts, community improvement districts, work of local authorities, LEPs, etc. Could you each give me some words, comments with regards to the government's devolution agenda, particularly in respect of mayors in combined authority areas? If we can start with you, Ailbhe.
Sure. We've actually had some really good work with mayors. So I suppose comments on devolution agenda. We feel that it really needs to go right down to the neighbourhood level, and that's the really tricky bit. You know, when you get right down to sort of the parish or town council, and lots of places don't have parishes, and hence the need for the idea around community improvement districts, giving people an ability to really engage at that neighbourhood level. But also with the mayors. So we've done a lot of work in Liverpool City region, and that mayoral structure has been very helpful there to sort of bring, 6 local authorities coming together and being able to work across the city region. There's been a lot of work done, supported by us, sort of understanding the social economy in Liverpool, and the combined authority really getting to grips with that, developing a strategy for growing the social economy. First of all, realizing how important it was in that city and in their workforce, and with ambitions to make Liverpool a more inclusive place to live and work, really pushing that social economy strategy. And that was really, led by the mayor, and very, I think the mayor has enabled that to happen. We see the same thing in the West Mids with Andy Street. Similarly, bringing all the actors together and developing a social economy strategy for that area, and wanting to double the social economy jobs in the region in, I think, 10 years. So really ambitious things I think mayors can do that perhaps, individual local authorities might not have come together to do. But yeah, the other aspect, which I think still needs thinking about, is that neighbourhood level. Actually devolving power down so that people in a place feel like they've got some power to control the things that matter to them in their day-to-day life.
Thanks, Ailbhe. Stephen?
Yeah, a slightly different perspective is when I went back to Newcastle and the North East back in 2015. Obviously, the mayors had spawned and Andy Street and Andy Burnham during that period. Maybe it's human nature, but sometimes as humans, if there's like a mayor or a government, we expect them to take responsibility. And it almost prevents us stepping in and just getting on and doing what we know is the right thing to do. So there were some people doing amazing stuff in Newcastle, and homeless and apprenticeships and work experience and loads of great stuff. But some people actually said to me, well, it's because we don't have a mayor. And I just thought, wow, it's almost like waiting for a North Star to appear. And yeah, obviously the mayor is a pivot point where people can galvanize around, and I think it's fantastic. But in those areas where they don't have a mayor, there's amazing local councillors, MPs, business people, LEPs, and charities that can actually get that, make that magic happen at the neighborhood level, and spawn programs that can scale across the region. So I wouldn't want to, portray mayors as a paradigm shift, and we don't want it to prevent us doing what we know is the right thing. But where they have been appointed, and they do provide, I think, a beacon of light where they can galvanize a community together, and independent politics, they can actually bring communities together and be a really, really strong focal point. And I welcome that. But what I would say is, where mayors don't exist, or where devolution hasn't kind of reached those regions, there's still some really, if you look at South Wales and some of the areas out in Belfast, you look at, there's not necessarily a mayor there, but there's structures where you can connect the dots together and make some really important stuff happen, and really bring communities together.
Thank you, Stephen. We're just coming up to our final 5 minutes. I would just like to ask Jill Rutter, who's with British Future, if she would like to ask any question of our panelists whilst you're here, Jill. Is there anything that you would like to ask?
Just 2 very brief questions. I think kind of to Stephen, I mean, carrots are always better than sticks, but do you think you need a kind of baseline of kind of what a basic obligation of a business should be in a community? And to Ailbhe, very quickly, we've seen the consultation on planning regulations close very recently. I wonder if we could use the planning system more imaginatively to plan for social connection. And I'm thinking in particular of high streets, which are so very, very important in terms of kind of social connection, and which is kind of sadly taking a bit of a battering.
Yes, Ailbhe, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yes, and we have been engaging a little bit with the planning reforms. I mean, it's not our core our core business, but there is the idea with the community should get involved in setting the design codes, and the idea with the new system that the community will actually be very involved at the start in setting the vision for what the place needs to look like. It's sort of an opportunity, but also, a lot of places the community hasn't got the capacity to come together in that way. And we've seen it with neighbourhood plans, where the places like the mutual aid groups, the places with the better social fabric already, and the better connections and better social infrastructure, are better able to do the neighbourhood planning and come together. So I think it's, if it's going to work, it will need really some thinking about how you're going to make sure that this happens everywhere, and that communities in every place are really able to come together and input into that. And also on an ongoing basis, not just sort of once and then it's set for a decade, because places change and communities change. So I think if a lot of thinking goes into how that might work, it could be an opportunity for communities to actually have some more power in that system. But obviously, the way it's designed, conceived at the moment, is that you kind of get one shot and then the codes are set. And so it's also kind of a high risk scenario. So it really needs to be thought through how we can make that work so that people really have that input and can potentially have it at more than one time.
Thank you, Ailbhe. Stephen?
And Jill, so 2 aspects. One which we haven't, which is out of scope for this, but I do believe, particularly on the high street, some of the big tech companies should pay their taxes in the UK. So effectively, you've got an absurd situation where a small business in Hastings is actually subsidising Amazon by selling its products, when the small business is paying business rates and rent. And actually, the digital sales tax that was introduced has been passed back to the small businesses. So, there's some dysfunctional things happening, but it's a whole kind of outside the scope of this AP. But my general ethos, Jill, is absolutely companies should take responsibility. They should pay fair taxes, but they should take responsibility in their local community. And to probably accelerate that, there's some very simple things you could do, because there's great institutions out there like the British Chamber of Commerce, FSB, and if one of their regular sessions, an MP came along and talked about what they expect in terms of community businesses to support the community and step in and engage around the topics we talked about for the last hour or so, then that would be a shift and a nudge towards the right direction. But yes, I do believe it's the responsibility of businesses to be an active part of their communities.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you.
Would you like to ask anything else, Jill?
No, that's it. It's been a great session and really, really useful, and great to hear about Stephen and Ailbhe's work.
Thank you.
So in conclusion, thank you both for joining us today. It has been truly insightful. I've made pages and pages of notes here, and I know that your contributions will feature very heavily in our report. So this is our third of 5 inquiry sessions, and we're planning to produce a report in around the March time, providing us with the anniversary of the start of COVID. Would you just like to just give us a few words in conclusion? Stephen, you first, please.
Yeah, I think what have we all learned through the last 9 months? Yeah, the red-blooded capitalism has failed. Simple as that. Government has taken unprecedented measures not known in any of our lifetime. And coming out of this, obviously, we're going to now have to deal with a significant recession, big youth unemployment, and sadly, it's probably the most disadvantaged individuals in our society and the regions who are going to be worst affected. And then we've obviously got to navigate carefully out of the customs union over the next few months as well. So there's a lot of uncertainty. And I think where you have a lot of uncertainty, what life has told me in terms of it's a moment for great leadership to step in and really paint a very positive vision for Britain and the sort of country we want to be, which is obviously multi-tolerant, multi-ethnic, multi-racial, welcoming, inclusive, and the people who are the wealth creators are the businesses. And therefore, I think it's a golden opportunity for us to redefine the role of business in our country and really connect businesses into the community, because they at the very local level can make a massive difference in terms of giving opportunity and hope to the younger people and the vulnerable people, and support the amazing infrastructure of charities out there to make a difference and actually make us very proud of what Britain is. So I think it's a golden opportunity, and it'd be a travesty if we wasted that opportunity to really change the culture of the country to be really inclusive, really connected. And I absolutely applaud what this committee is doing. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. Ailbhe?
Yeah, I mean, I'll keep it brief, but I think the thing that we've obviously really seen is the importance of community throughout the pandemic. I mean, that surge in community spirit, it's all anybody talked about for the first few months. But the danger is that dissipates, and we did even see it begin to dissipate over the summer. And research from previous sort of crisis situations has shown that you get this big peak and then it sort of tapers off. So I think the important question for policy and MPs to be thinking about is, what can we do to try and capture that and sustain it, because it is a good thing and it has only got benefits for our society. So how can we capitalize and sustain some of that for the longer term?
Thank you, Ailbhe. Thank you both very much indeed.